Morning, or no, good afternoon, good evening. Oh my goodness, I'm all messed up. Welcome to Crazy Talk. For those of you who are tuning in for the first time, Crazy Talk is a Facebook Live TV show where I interview all sorts of amazing people about all sorts of stuff related to mental health. I'm your host, Lee Thomas. If this is not your first time watching Crazy Talk, thank you so much for coming back. I'm glad we haven't scared you away. If you're tuning in, whether you are watching the show live here right now or if you're watching the replay, be sure to, give us some likes, give us some loves. We love to see those little bubbles bubble across the screen, whatever it is. I'm really excited for this week's episode of Crazy Talk because I'm going to be interviewing someone who I have followed on Twitter for many, many years and who is just absolutely brilliant. So I'm going to be interviewing Rachel Cooper. Rachel Cooper is currently a graduate student at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. Her professional experiences include working as a peer support specialist for an innovative recovery college, managing the creation and implementation of peer initiatives programming at a youth mental health agency in downtown Toronto, advocating for systemic mental health and addictions policy change at the provincial level, and, if that wasn't enough, most recently co-leading the From Surviving to Advising program at the University of Toronto Department of Psychiatry, which pairs people with lived experience with the psychiatric residents to provide unique education about recovery, hope, and many other topics from the lens of service users. Throughout all of her work, Rachel has grappled with questions pertaining to how people with lived experience can take on roles of increasing seniority and leadership within the mainstream mental health system, and her Master's of Education coursework will focus on the role of service users in formal medical education. She is also interested in the intersection between personal and professional identity as it pertains to service users in medical education and the associated ethical issues that emerge, and we're going to get really into that today. Besides her professional work and grad school studies, Rachel is interested in American politics. Good time to be interested in American politics, biomedical ethics, qualitative research methods, and narrative medicine. She can usually be found with her earbuds in, listening to a podcast while drinking coffee or ice cream, or eating ice cream, not drinking ice cream. Oh, I've already messed up. Rachel, thank you so much for being on the show. We're so glad to have you.
Hello, it's so nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
So, Rachel, you were involved in so much stuff. So much stuff when it comes to mental health. It's amazing.
Thank you. It sounds like a lot of things. I mean, it feels manageable to me, but I get from reading the bio that it sounds like a lot of things.
I mean, I don't want to be telling you how to live your life, but I think it is a lot of things. I don't want you to be downplaying your accomplishments because you are so involved in stuff that has to do with mental health, and especially this patient advocate or patient engagement piece. Sorry, that I think is really, really interesting. Can you tell us a little bit about? Can you tell us a little bit more about kind of how and why you got involved in that?
Yeah, I mean, so I've had lived experience going back a very long time, and after having a very kind of rocky road to recovery, and also working with a psychiatrist who really understood the importance of patient-centered care and actually practiced that, and you could see he did that. He kind of started nudging me a little bit and saying, you have important things to say. Maybe you need to figure out where you can say them and have them heard. And then after doing work in a sector outside of mental health, I decided I actually wanted to work in the sector, and I took some training around peer support and did that frontline work, and have just kind of managed slowly over time to find other interesting things that allows me to think really broadly about systems change, but also where possible to kind of bring my own individual experience and meet a lot of cool people along the way and learn new skills and do fun things. So
learning new skills, doing fun things. I love it. So there's so much stuff that I want to follow up with. Well, we met at the peer support conference, as you reminded me when we were backstage. I was like, I've known you on Twitter for so long. Where was it that we initially met?
We had lunch together one day in the hotel at the PSAC conference. So
I love it. And PSAC is still out there doing great work. Peer Support Canada now, always changing the branding. You know how it is in mental health. So that work as kind of a peer supporter and frontline worker, has that changed the way that you thought about patient engagement? Because I'm sure that it's one of those things where when you do that kind of work, it really informs kind of your whole outlook around the whole system, right?
Yeah, and I think where I've had the biggest impact is when I worked for the recovery college at St. Michael's Hospital. That was my first gig. And we were working with folks who were transitioning out of homelessness into housing or into more stable housing. And so, you think about folks who are really um, they they struggle in a lot of ways, and often those voices aren't heard. And I don't think policy actually is geared towards folks who are really struggling with multiple different things in their lives. So, from working with that crew of people who were amazing and opened my eyes a lot, um, I think I have a much more critical equity lens in terms of the kind of policies that I'm advocating for, but also in terms of when we're doing patient engagement across any of the projects that I work in, like thinking much more about who's not sitting at the table, who is obviously very missing, and like what kind of supports need to be in place for people to feel like they can show up and contribute meaningfully. So I think a lot about honorarium and remuneration and how do you compensate people ethically for doing work that inevitably asks questions of their own experiences, and if not done in a very sensitive and sort of ethical way, can be seen as either manipulating people or taking advantage of people. So, like, I think really broadly about that, I find it super interesting, and I'm not sure even in the work that I do now that it's always being done so well. Like, I have to think like reflectively very often about like, what am I doing? What decisions am I making in my different roles, or am I advocating for that may or may not be beneficial to some and not all, or may be beneficial to more but not everyone.
Yeah, and that idea of like kind of compensating people for their expertise. I was in Ottawa briefly for one single day, the day that the tornado hit. Fun. Um and I was there for a youth board meeting for a big mental health project. And one of the things we were talking about in terms of specifically youth engagement, but I think this probably stems across a lot of patient engagement, is the idea that people want often patients' stories, but they don't want their solutions. So they want you to go out on stage and be like, this is all the terrible stuff that happened in my life. But then when you're like, here's what we should do about it, they're like, like, what are you doing? Get off stage. We have like people with letters behind their name to do that.
Right. And it frustrates me. So it frustrates me so much because I think sometimes solutions come most of the time from people who see the problems in the system. And you have to kind of be in it to be able to say, like, actually, this could go so much better if you just tried this.
Yeah, there's kind of power in the complainers. We're kind of taught that, like, if you're someone who's kind of outside the system throwing rocks at it, then, like, you're never going to affect change. But we need people who are, throwing rocks and saying, this is not working well. Otherwise, we're going to get complacent in the work that we do.
Yeah, and it's easy when you're trying to do something as big as overhauling the mental health system in the province to be like, oh my God, however am I going to do this? And what I have found helpful over time is to really think about, like, on the ground, if someone is using services, if services are working better or the system is working better, like, what is the change going to be? Like, what's going to be different? And how is somebody going to actually experience that differently?
Yeah, and I guess that kind of answers my next question, which was going to be like, how do you manage that frustration? Because I always talk about when it comes to kind of advocacy, frustration management is like half of my job right now, because sometimes it's, you just feel like you're running into those brick walls all day every day. And so is it about focusing on, like, the incremental changes, or how do you manage that?
Okay, I am frustrated every single time. I am, like, super honestly, I think it's easy to get frustrated. I think it's easy to get frustrated, because like the pace at which things change is so glacial. I feel like I've lived 100 lives already and nothing has really changed. But I also feel frustrated because I think people get involved with doing like patient engagement work as it is for different reasons, and they have different kinds of expectations. And I get particularly frustrated. This is like an example from today, where people are not thinking critically about the implications of making certain decisions. And it's like, okay, you're also a patient or someone who identifies with as having lived experience, or, having a personal connection to this work. And yet, I feel resentful that I have to explain to you that what you're suggesting actually has a lot of negative implications that will have ramifications in terms of, like, how we conceive of our work and the precedent it sets for future work after this. So I have learned to, like, find people within like who I work with on various projects who are like good confidants, and they can provide the peer support around doing the work, and managing the politics of doing the work and the frustration of doing the work. And sometimes I just have to listen to podcasts about American politics because it's a whole other frustration that's like much further from my front door. And then I can kind of like change my headspace a little bit. But it's a long game. It's not going to be a instantaneous shift. I know that much.
Yeah, and sometimes it can be frustrating, especially with like changes in government, right? Where it feels like you've built up and up and up, and it only takes one government to kind of come in and pull the rug out from underneath you.
No comment.
Yeah, no, we don't need to get into specifics, but I think that's a really interesting point around kind of sometimes even patients who are engaging in this patient engagement piece, or service users or clients or whatever the correct word is. Sometimes we don't always think about the implication. Like, we're thinking about our own story, right? We're thinking about like, this would have helped me, and we don't always think about like, how could this spiral out and either help or harm other people. And you see that even in storytelling, right? Like, I always think back to when I first started sharing my story with people, and there was some stuff that I look back on and I'm like, ooh, shouldn't have said that. Ooh, regret sharing that. But it's kind of, I guess, a learning process between sharing things that are true and sharing things that are helpful, and focusing on things that would have helped us versus focusing on things that will help a good number of people. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I mean, I come up against that a lot when I do the work with the psychiatry residents, because it's a small group of us. There's about 15. Then we're educating these residents that are coming through their psychiatry training. And we're not a representative sample, for example, of the kinds of clients they're interacting with on that particular rotation. And so, I'm happy to share when, the residents ask me, like, what was helpful for you? Or like, what was the thing that, kind of shift your trajectory? And I'm like, okay, that works for me. I'm an N of 1. How useful is this? Actually, I'd be more interested to hear like what you're doing and how I can help you course correct, because I'm not going to be the same as any of your other patients that you're ever going to deal with unless you deal with me as a patient, and I hope that never happens. So let's talk about me. Let's talk about you.
Yeah, and kind of taking those kind of exceptions sometimes. Like a lot of the time, I was talking with another mental health advocate about this, and it's like, sometimes we're not representative because we are, no longer patients. We're no longer clients. And, our experience is still really real and really valid. But like, do I know what it's like being in a hospital in 2018? I'm like, what year is it? Like, no, because I haven't been in a hospital in 2018. So I think being, mindful of the space that we take up and being like, this is my experience. It's 100% true. And the fact that it's, not necessarily everyone else's experience doesn't make it less valid, but I have to be careful of who I'm talking over, especially being like so privileged in so many other ways, right? Like, I'm white, I'm middle class, I've got a lot going for me. And so sometimes you see that in advocacy spaces where it's the same players in the room all the time, people who know the lingo and know kind of what the mental health advocate party line is, which can be really difficult.
And I mean, I think that speaks to something else that I've been sort of grappling with and having conversations with people about recently, is around like, how do you mentor people who clearly have like the skills, or they have like, you see the capability in them. Maybe they're not quite there yet to actually do the kind of advocacy work that you envision them being able to do eventually. And how do you help people like get experience that kind of allows them to dip their toe in, to feel safe, to also get exposed to like very different kinds of viewpoints, and sometimes like very harsh viewpoints or disagreeable viewpoints, and then have them know that they can get feedback and support around doing work that's just inherently very difficult and very tiring, and can actually take a huge it can be an impediment to wellness at times for some people, I think.
Oh, definitely. Because sometimes the system kind of, can chew you up and spit you out if you're not careful. And it's one of those things that...
Even if you are...
True.
It'll still chew you up and spit you out.
Yeah. And that was something that I never really thought of until it was actually the peer support conference where we met. It had never occurred to me, because I was like always super pro peer support, and I still am pro peer support. But the idea of once you are like out as a peer supporter, like you can't really get that back a lot of the time. And that's something that, like, I mean, my story is like is way out there. Like a quick Google search will tell people all you need to know about me. And I'm comfortable with that now, but it's always that moment of like, oh, you know, in 20 years, am I going to wish that I hadn't told that story? Am I going to wish that like everyone on the internet didn't know that about me? And it's impossible to know, right? Like it's impossible to know how I'm going to feel about that in 20 years. But it's you can't it's like closing the barn door after the horses are gone. I don't have the right simile for this, but
you can't delete it. It's out there. You can't take it back. It's hard. It's actually so hard. And I think over time I think my story is important. I think I've learned a lot when I have shared my story. And there are times where I feel it's really important to tell people what I've been through. But I also think it's super important to ask people what they've been through. And I think, like, for myself, being able, in the spirit of peer support, to say, like, I'm happy to just listen to you. And to nod affirmatively and to say, like, yeah, that really resonates with what I've been through, and leave it at that, you know? Because really, I think when people are in a moment of need, rarely do they want to hear what somebody else has been through. Like, they really, like, it's an inherently a selfish thing. People want to talk about what their problems are. So, you know, if I can give the gift of listening, then I'm happy to do that.
And that's something that it's funny because I teach that in mental health first aid, because we read this like poem thing where it says like, you are not listening to me when you tell me your story in a way that makes mine feel unimportant, or something along those lines. And often people are like, well, I share my story to like connect with people and you know, to let them know that I've been through something similar. And I was very much of that kind of feeling too. And I kind of spent a lot of time thinking about it. And it really is that feeling of like, that's me wanting to share my story. Like a lot of the times I'm sharing my story because I need them to know that I went through something similar, and that's based on my needs, not on theirs. But that's a hard thing to parse apart.
And it's going to depend on the kind of relationship you have with somebody and how well you know them. And I'm sure, like, it's like this with you, of people you're really close with, you know, they'll be telling you about whatever's happened in their day, and then like 15 minutes and you'll be like, hold on, I have to tell you what happened to me. Pause, like, please, I need to tell you. And then folks where there is a different kind of relationship, it's like, you know, there's more space, there's a different kind of space, there's a different kind of time. It kind of exists in a bit of a different realm. I don't know if that makes sense.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
And I think that in that realm, it's also, we were just having a conversation about this in my classes today, and we'll talk about grad school in a second, but that feeling of like, sometimes we really need to do that healing work ourselves before. And I'm not a big believer in that, like, people need to be like fully recovered before they can like be of help and of service to others. Like, that's just not kind of been my experience. This idea that we need to make peace somehow with our stories before we're able to help others make peace with theirs, maybe in that specific work. I don't have the wording quite worked out on it.
I think I've done like the deepest psychotherapeutic work that I've done on myself in the time I've been working with the residents, because I am now thinking about, like, how do I come to terms with or grieve or understand like these experiences that I do want to share, and how do I do it in a way where I can actually understand all the layers of it before I pull out like the little bits to make one layer to share with somebody else who's going to use it as a teaching tool, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, it's been really interesting fodder around how I do my own psychotherapy, and like those angles that I have to come at to say, like, in order to be able to share this with people within a teaching domain or an educational domain, like, we need to talk about this first. Like, please, let's have this conversation first.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I guess, is there a tension there? And I think it might have been mentioned in your bio. I'm so sorry. Like the tension between kind of being someone who shares their story a little bit to help other people learn, but also being someone who's working in the field. Is there kind of a tension between those identities?
Yeah, I mean, I think some days I feel it more than other days. So, I mean, like a good example is, you know, I co-lead this Surviving to Advising program with a psychiatrist. And I've been really clear with myself of like the boundaries of what I'll share with him and what I won't share with him. partially just to maintain my own privacy and like my own kind of sense of space around it. But also, like, he's my colleague. He's not my psychiatrist. And I'm really clear, like, he has a particular role. In relation to him, I have a particular role. Like, we need to keep those roles. And I need to establish, like, a safety net of support for myself that's robust enough that I have multiple people that I can take my various issues to. And also finding ways to say, and he's been super respectful of this, of like, you know what, I'm not having a good day right now. Like, I'm really struggling. And I need to know that I can just let you know that, and that's going to be sufficient in terms of us being able to negotiate out what kind of work I still need to do for you. And it's been a pleasure learning that from this particular person, because I don't think it's like that with everybody. And so I'm grateful that I've had the chance to practice that skill in a place where it's been, you know, well received.
Yeah. And I'm so happy that you have a place where that's well received. And I think that ties in really nicely with what I wanted to talk about, which was grad school. Because I think that's probably a place where it's not as well received. Because academia kind of has this culture of overworking and, you know, just push through, and it's fine as long as you get your work done. Like, is that something that, I know that's something that I'm kind of coming, and I'm in the social work faculty, right? So people are pretty understanding, but there is still kind of this culture of like, well, the work is the work and you have to get it done.
So, you know, it's interesting because I really struggled with that throughout undergrad, of really feeling this resentment, being a mature student, someone who went back after many years away because of my mental health. And really resenting that the profs didn't have a lot of flexibility around like their expectations and deadlines and due dates and stuff like that. And then coming to grad school, and I would say the average age of students in my program is slightly older, and most people are working full time while studying. And so the profs have, at least in the 2 classes I'm taking, have said, like, you know what, we know things happen. You have to let us know in advance, but we can negotiate it out. And so I feel like that is a nice kind of return to modernity around understanding that people have multiple things going on in their lives. I'm a student, but I'm not just a student. I hold down like many different kinds of gigs, and I do work that sometimes has conflicting priorities and timelines and stuff. And so to know that I can go to a colleague, being the prof, and saying like, look, like, this is what I think I can do. I don't think it'll happen when you need it to do, but this is like, let's figure this out together. I don't know. Maybe I'm just in the minority of that. I'm not sure.
No, and that's really interesting to me, because I remember very much in my undergrad, it was kind of like, you have to get this done because in the workplace there's going to be deadlines and you have to meet them. And then when I kind of got out of academia and went into the workplace, I was like, oh, these deadlines are flexible. Like, it's very rare that your boss is going to be like, or at least in my experience, that your boss is going to be like, I need this due now, and it doesn't matter what's going on in your life, just do it. Like, or when I was briefly in a job like that, I didn't last very long. Like,
yeah, and I mean, my experience of being in the workplace is that most workplaces are team-based, and if you have a strong team dynamic, then, you know, there's support there as well. And we don't seem to really talk about that. Team assignments, like group assignments, is like a whole other rant that it's not worth our time, because I'm watching the clock and I can see we're pretty much done.
Oh yeah. Oh, I'm glad you're watching the clock, because I'm just like in it.
Right, that's my facilitator skill set. I can walk and tell you what time it is.
Oh, I love it, because I was like, even anyone who's been in any of my courses can tell you that I set alarms. Like, I'm like, if I don't set an alarm for our 10:30 break, we're not getting one.
You have to go now.
So it has been really amazing having you on the show. Like, I just feel like we could have talked for another hour, but you know, I've set my 30-minute deadline, and so I guess we should meet it. So for folks who are watching, whether they're watching live or watching the replay, and what would you like them to kind of do next? What can they follow up with?
Yeah. So I think you talked about the call to action before we got on this thing, and I totally forgot about it. I would say, like, just remain curious, ask questions. If you're involved in different projects and things don't sit right, or, you know, there's dynamics that you kind of are seeing but you can't really identify, raise them. You know, don't be the person who just ignores what's going on. Like, think critically about what you're involved in and how it relates to you, and how people are asking you to share your story or not share your story and what that means, and know that, you know, as free human beings, we always have a choice to say no, and sometimes that does come at a cost, but sometimes, you know, that pain of saying no is actually a really good springboard to something that might be more aligned with what you're interested in doing.
Wow, can't believe you're just out here dropping wisdom like that. Like, that was amazing. I'm like, oh, I feel inspired.
I'll shout out to my psychiatrist, who always asks me when I make decisions about different things in my life if it aligns with my values. And I thought that was such a bullshit thing to ask when I started working with the guy. And now it's like, doggone it, everything has to be aligned with my values. But I feel much better. So I guess maybe his treatment works. I don't know.
So maybe he's on to something.
Maybe. But I would say, like, if something doesn't fit right, then there's probably something that's not fitting right. And it's worth it to examine that and see what can be made of it.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think that's amazing. So again, Rachel, thank you so much for being on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure. It's been an absolute joy having you on the show. For the thanks. For those of you who are watching, be sure to tune in to our next episode, which is going to be, again, Wednesday at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. It is a new time, but we're starting to get used to it. And if you're watching Crazy Talk and you're going like, wow, Crazy Talk is so much fun, I want to get episodes of Crazy Talk directly to my inbox. You can do that by signing up for my mailing list, and you can sign up for my mailing list by going to leethomas.ca, and there's a little pop-up that'll greet you, and it'll ask you to sign up for my mailing list. You can do it in there. And then you will get episodes of Crazy Talk directly to your inbox every Wednesday, as well as updates on other kind of webinars and other fun stuff that I've got going on. Thank you so much for tuning in. Again, Rachel, thank you so much for being on the show, and I will see all of you next week, again, Wednesday at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. Take care, everyone.
Bye, Lee.